don't know what to do or say, 'cause all this is pretty dumb. Bum bum. Badunk dunk. Hello. Hello. 'Cause all this is pretty dumb. Bum bum. Badunk dunk. Hello. Yeah, I said all that, didn't I? Either way. Today we are going to talk about educational objective. Now, objective of education. Educational objectives or learning outcomes are statements that are clearly describe what the learner will know or be able to do as a result of having attended an educational program or activity. Educational objectives must be observable and measurable. Now, I kind of went back to looking at the statements that I made about public education, the education industry as a whole, and kind of wanted to get back to it. Talking about public education and da 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 da. But I'm not gonna get into what I got into previously, which was more about kind of drawing like a web idea of things. Now, why I just add that? Also, excuse my handwriting because it's all over the place. Why is education important? Well, it is an integral, right? Integral, in the sense that it is something that is a part of everybody's life to some degree. And I'll get more into this. It is an integral, enforced, and a foundational part of Western culture. And by Western culture, I don't necessarily mean what is landlocked by, landlocked by American standards, European standards. It's more the view of what is the standard of a first world country. Like what are the linchpins of what we consider kind of civilized society in a way. Keep in mind the practice and methods are vastly different. Where did I write this? Methods are vastly different. Depending on region or geolocation. And my notes are everywhere on this. Anyway, keep in mind this only speaks of Western world, first world, best or civilized world, society, culture, etc., etc. Speaking on traits that are above, superior, or best of. And the reason why I word it this way is because the people that have largely been not designing, but the people that are largely have a stake in what the education system is, at least viewing it in the sense of what is educational, you have to view this in the lens of how the best minds view this. I say here, view this as a eugenicist or a zoologist, a class society that considers data king, but it's skewed and funded in a specific direction or vision. I said this because not everyone's opinion of what education should look like, or it's not efficient in any way, is what I'm trying to specifically say. But it is directed, designed. There was a view of how this system should work and how it should be integrated into our society. Is kind of what I'm saying. And the reason why I say specifically a eugenicist or a zoologist is because you have to view this as what would be the best system designed for teaching mass amounts of people and getting them all on the same page. And it's not right. This wasn't designed in a way that is considerate of everyone's traits, of everyone's skill set, or what people are best at. It was just funded in a specific direction. There was a vision for this. And to move further with this goes into not all opinions are equal professionally. Now, when I say not all opinions are equal, there is this level of professionalism that comes with having certain opinions. And when I say professionally, you have to think of the world stage. For those that play status theater, and by status theater, I mean I graduated from XYZ University. I have XYZ medical degrees. I'm a doctor in this specific field. I have X, Y, or Z experience that gives me the credibility, the status, right? Credibility is status, that I can largely define myself by this status. And then, we kind of see it with, I don't want to say DeGrasse Tyson. What's that famous science black guy? Either way, there are there's this form of theater that we play with people's professions, and they get invited to certain parties, they get invited to certain interviews. Their opinion will stand above others. That's what I mean by status theater, because there is a dynamic between, right, education systems that create certain individuals that then we will idolize to some degree, and then they get to play part in this, now I don't want to say otherworldly aspect of our lives, but in a weird way they kind of do, because we then look towards them to value their opinion in whatever field they are in. With those who hold power on a global effect way. Now I say effect because it affects the minds of many people, and it'll sway public opinion one way or the other. Because remember, the minds of men are what's more important. It's kind of why there's this entire system that generates professionalism. It generates value on people's existences. Either way, some people just, did I continue writing? No. Some people just worship and disregard reason to align themselves with pre-established, learned, and I got more to habits. Now, by pre-established and learned, we learn to value opinions of people who have done the work. They've gone through the stages. They've gotten the degree. And this is something we've learned. We've been conditioned to. And the reason why I ended up just going with the word habits is because at the end of the day, it's become a habit to lean towards other people's opinions and to lean towards other people's professionalism as a means of, well, they've done the work, we can trust them. It's that I'll just lean back, kick back, and not give a fuck about anything that I can do, or my opinion, or X, Y, or Z person's opinion. This goes into, it's a loop system where instead of people, I always kind of like using the iPhone analogy, right? We're against slavery here in America. People have this very negative view of slavery. People have this very negative connotation of what that means. But we'll buy iPhones, which are essentially a new form of slave labor that kind of supports concentration camps in a weird way. But we have this whole negative view of what a concentration camp is, what slavery is, what forced labor is. But when it comes down to the free market, and when it comes down to buying the next best product, it just kind of goes away, because it's become a habit to not lean into our own belief system, into our own decision-making capabilities, because it's become a habit to, well, governments wouldn't do that, right? We have people put into place and power who wouldn't allow these such things to happen, but here we are. These are harder to break. A habit is much harder to break. Now, I kind of went off into a tangent now that I'm thinking about this, because I came to the conclusion that a habit is what we've developed in our educational system. Because learning is easy, but changing a lifestyle, that's not easy, right? We have this whole thing of, I'm going to new year, new me. We're going to have a diet. We're going to change our lifestyle. We're going to incorporate this new way of living into our lives. That's much harder to embrace. But learning something isn't that hard. It's just, oh, look, I learned something new today. But because it's become a habit to live our life a certain way, that gets much harder to break. So changing a habit and a life you have no clue as to what it looks like. There's this whole thing that I started getting to where I started realizing that the problem and the cognitive dissonance that people are experiencing right now is the fact that because we don't know what life looks like without these systems, it's a very scary thing. It's like, how am I going to take this new step into life without knowing what's on the other side? Because we've been conditioned to thinking of what life should look like based on what movies we've seen, based on what things we've experienced in our lives, that it becomes harder to break out of that habit because I've seen this person do it. I've seen that person do it. I've seen these examples in my life of how things should be done. But when it comes down to embracing something that we've never seen what it looks like, that becomes very scary. And kind of, well, I'll get more into it because I think I wrote about it. Most find embracing a new worldview, and by worldview, that just kind of means like interacting with government, changing how things are done, right? That encompasses a worldview, because when you have a new way of looking at life, to some degree, it is changing how things are done, not just in your own personal life, but even within government, even within systems like the DMV, or something mundane as getting a library card. But either way, people see this convoluted, jumbled mess of, I don't even know where to begin. Does it start here? Does it start there? Does it start here? Like, where is this mess begin? It is something so complex, large, and vague, right? That it's not that it is complex, large, or vague. It's just that's what we assume it to be, because it's something we've never learned how to interact with, something that we've never learned how to interact with. Like, how do we change, right? In this case, it would be about the educational system. How do we change that? Where does that puzzle piece start? And again, because we've never learned about it, or because we've never seen it, or because it's never been defined in our lives, it just becomes this complex, large, vague system. And because of the view of it being complex, large, and vague, our mind will just spin circles, and we'll be like, I have no idea where to, like, right? You get analysis paralysis sort of thing. Largely, my conclusion as to why this is so scary, it's just science and concepts, ideas at the end of the day. We weren't taught, right? Like, these things are just ideas, systems, concepts, or just, what's the other word that I'm kind of like loosely grasping at here? These are just things that we were never taught. Like, they were omitted from the teaching procedure, because now if you've never learned, it's like filtering water. How does river water go, or like river water, ocean water, like how do we just get dirty water and turn it into clean water? Like, those are systems. That's like a system that we don't know how it interacts with. But if you look into why wells were favored, at least at one point in time, for drinking water, it's because there is this natural formation of layers of earth that form, that once the water filters through each layer of dirt, soil, sand, I can't remember what else is in there, but once it filters through that system, the water at the bottom is drinkable, because it's filtered out naturally, the impurities. And that's what makes drinkable water, is it filtering through certain layers of dirt, earth, minerals, etc., etc. And it kind of gets into explaining why some water is soft water and why some water is hard water. But that's not what we're getting into, right? That's just a science that explains a system, a concept, an idea, and that is how I'm able to explain it to you. Now, when we get into back to habits and why they're hard to break, is because it's become a habit to not know these things. It's become a habit to being like, well, if it wasn't taught to me in school, it's not important. if it wasn't taught to me by this person who went through all these years to get this degree, it's not real. It's not important. It's not a part of my life. And it layers into cognitive dissonance where it's much easier to say, I don't know. It's much easier to be like, well, this doesn't really matter. This gets into a bigger thing that I will get to in a bit. So we weren't taught none of these things. So I'd love to ask once more, why is education so important? Like all things we interact with, it has an objective. Now, this is where I got to defined by Google. I've read this before, which is this. Educational objectives or learning outcomes are statements that clearly describe blah, 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 blah. Essentially, I'm describing the word objective. Now, is there anything else that I wrote? Oh, yeah. Learning outcomes. That means you're learning the defined idea are statements that are clearly describe what the learner will know. So that means these are ideas that you're supposed to learn the outcome of, right? It's like showing your math or showing your work in doing a math problem. You're learning the outcomes and how you get to that outcome. And these statements will clearly describe what the learner will know or be able to do as a result of having attended an educational program. This just essentially describes that in order to learn the answer, you have to clearly go through an educational program to learn what describes the thing, the idea, the concept of these things. So, my favorite part of this was educational objective. The educational objectives must be objectives. Why did I write that way? Educational objectives must be observable and measurable. I guess I just rewrote the word for whatever reason. Either way. Now, this is where I got into what is an objective. A thing aimed at or sought. A goal. I actually had to go to Word Hippo. Word Hippo is just a nice resource that gives you definitions and all this other shit. Either way. No, objective. Now, this is kind of where I got funny because I like how it describes the adjective first in objective, when it kind of, in my opinion, should be a noun. Because a noun, right? Let's just go back to like fucking 3rd grade or whatever. A noun, a word other than a pronoun used to identify any class of people, places, or things, or to name a particular one of these. Now, that doesn't really describe, like, what is an objective then? How are we describing objective as a noun? And when you look at the history of this, noun comes from nomen, which is just name, right? That just means this is the name of this thing, the name of this word and this word is just used to describe what we're describing now. And an adjective is a word or phrase naming an attribute added to or grammatically related to a noun to modify or describe it. Now, come from Old French. Either way. Back to objective, at least what I wanted to get to. So a noun, in terms of what an objective is a thing aimed at or sought, a goal, right? The name, or at least what describes a noun in terms of a noun, is something that you're aiming at, something that you're trying to like pinpoint, you're trying to put your finger on it. The adjective is just the descriptor. It's just describing something. But I love how when you type in objective, the first thing that you're going to get is not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. And I thought that was kind of funny because it's like, well, that's when you're being objective. That isn't necessarily unobjective. right? Either way, I just thought it was interesting. A thing aimed at or sought, a goal. There is a goal in this situation because we'll get into that later. Learning about noun comes from nomen, which is name. In this case, the name describing what an objective is. So, implying no such forethought or planning, development exist, it's kind of rude, right? Because when at least education became something, at least when it went under the wing of government, when it got subsidized and when it started getting funding, that means that it had to go through these two stages, planning and developing. I don't know how to go from here to what I said next. A lot of money circulates because it's not that it was planned that they were going to sell books. It's not that it was planned that there was going to be this whole industry about selling pens or selling markers, selling art supplies, selling book bags, right? That industry came later, right? Because now you can buy any Disney movie backpack. You can buy a variety of different sort of backpacks from like different brands, or right? That came later. I think at the early stages of life, the planning that went into creating an educational program was primarily, how do I say this? There wasn't no grand scheme of things. There wasn't like this big conspiracy that we're gonna only teach people this XYZ. No, like if you get a lot of early educational text, they're pretty shit. Like there was no real forethought in some of these things because a lot of them became outdated very quickly. It was only later that it got more refined as time went on. But as it is now, a lot of money does circulate through this system. So that's neither here nor there. The money for education is big business. And that's kind of where I went off into a tangent. Because what I really wanted to stick with, at least I should highlight this in some sort of like fuchsia. Because I need to rewrite this in my opinion. Rewrite that. Because I really want to explain the fact that there was a big difference between the educational system that developed from the 1918 all the way to 1930. It was kind of patchy. There was a lot of things that were still getting put into place because it was more of they were just shooting darts. Nothing was really sticking until they further did more research into how the human brain kind of interacts with certain systems. And a lot of the development that came from the Department of Psychology from like the 1925 to 1946 is what kind of really refined it, because at that point in time they really started figuring out how, not how people learn, it's just how people interact with certain systems of government, and how people kind of confuse authority and authenticity with the person that they're seeing in front of them, right? Because they look at a teacher and they think of the teacher as a point of authority without realizing that that teacher is just a normal person. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but either way. Moving on from that, the money for education is big business. This came later, at the advent of supply sales, which is essentially them just, right, pens, pencils, the paper demographic, book binding, chairs, desks, bookshelves, right? Like anything that goes into maintaining a school, think of that. But it also gets much bigger than that, because you have grants, loans, interest, and that comes later, right? That comes in the university aspect of things. Now, let's think about it for a bit. Extra cost. And this specifically only really applies to America. It's raining outside, and I don't know if you guys can hear that. Because in America, there is no school cost. Everywhere else, you have to pay for school. There are tuition fees that are related to these things. So, kind of one of my first experiences to this was when I was living in Mexico. You have to buy your own textbooks in Mexico. The school does not provide any of this for you. It might be the fact that I went to a private school, but last I remembered, they still have stationery stores where it's a store that sells nothing but the book supplies that you're going to need. And then there is this tie-in where schools kind of communicate, at least regional wise, they communicate to certain stationary schools, and there is a touching point where the school does have to communicate with these stationary schools and tell them, like, these are the textbooks we're going to use for this year. You're going to be our exclusive school that's going to sell our uniform. You're going to sell this. You're going to sell that. So there's like this tie-in that comes in with all this. And that was like the first time I ever really experienced the fact that I had to buy my own books. It was like, whoa, wait, the school doesn't provide these? Either way. So keep in mind that in America and parts of the Western world, the fact that we get provided the textbook is only within our own borders. Other regions, that kind of differs actually. So by extra cost, when I say books, or at least now that I'm talking about extra cost, I'm more talking about the university aspect of things. So you have your books, housing, food expenses, right? That aspect of thing, the aspect of extra cost, it's a great thing to learn, especially when you're older, you're an adult, and you're kind of going through the motions of life. But basically, this was designed to some degree. Like I said, there has to be a touching point between marketing firms, book sales, or at least book binding companies, and authors, writers. I should probably rewrite this too. Rewrite all this. And I didn't do it in the right color. Because there is some forethought, or at least somebody had to recognize that these systems were going to play into one another. It's why when you're offered a grant or when you're offered loans to going to university, to some degree, FAFSA or people working at FAFSA understand that if this is going to be your major and this is what you're going to study for, they understand to some degree because they've spoken to the market. They're like, oh, if this person's going to study these classes during this semester, during this term, that means the books that they're going to buy are going to cost this much. And if they're going to cost this much, this is how much money we should pre-allocate to their grant and to their loan. So there is a touching point between the market and the loan and the grants, at least what's offered to students. And remember, keep in mind, this is only applicable to the Western world because everywhere else, you're fucking shit out of luck if you can't buy your own books. For many years, and as bells and whistles. Okay. Kind of lost my forethought here because when I say for many years and has bells and whistles, at this point in time, what I was thinking, at least in this point in time, was the fact that the market understands that FAFSA, or the loan givers, or people who allocate money towards students, they understand that this is a system that they're interacting with. They understand that it has, I'm not saying like there's a button you push and it just says print money, but there is this occurrence of general interest. By that I mean there is something valuable that comes with interacting with these systems, right? So when there's a new book That means the book publisher is going to communicate to these classes that are teaching this subject, and it's going to tell all of these teachers, hey, you're no longer using this book anymore. You're going to use the new volume that we came out with this next year. So that means there is bells and whistles, as in there are levers. There's a system that interacts with the market and teachers to some degree. Series of functions that interest groups interact with. Essentially what I described. This is why it's good to make these videos, because I can rethink everything that I was writing. There's a lot of eyes and hands involved in a system that locks you down for and this is where I lose the tangent. Because at this point in time, I was talking about just say manufacturers, books, and loan. I'm just gonna say money printer. Money printer, go burr. Either way. Anything else that I want to reword here? For many years and has bells and whistles, general interest groups. Okay, basically this was designed. Another thing that I really wanted to emphasize here with this was designed, we can clearly see that there was a big difference from the way that universities worked from the 70s going into the 80s to the 90s, because it went less from a system of being right. Because I have older sisters, so I remember one of them having a conversation with me where they basically told me that how lucky I was and blah blah blah, and a lot of it came from the fact that the loans that I was receiving were different from hers, because when she went to school, she had to get audited. They had to look at her background. They had to look at what school she went to. They had to look at what classes she took. They had to do a full shakedown of who she was as a person, because at the end of the day, the bank that gave her the loan to go to school was taking a risk by giving her money for her to go to school. So she really needed to be on top of her shit in order for them to take the risk and loan her all this money, right? Because if she flopped, well, that money's kind of lost. At least that was it during the time when you could still file for bankruptcy and your loans wouldn't affect you. At some point in time, it actually changed, where now when you go bankrupt, your student loans aren't applicable for that bankruptcy file. Either way. So to some degree, remember, there is this interlocked system that understands its position in our lives, where you have the industry interacting with politicians, and politicians rewriting the laws, legislation, and policy in order to make things easier for the industry. And the industry encompasses universities, colleges, booksellers, book publishers, the authors that kind of interact with these systems that then later get to write the books that you essentially use for your class, etc., etc. Bells and whistles. That's why I say general interest, because there is a level of general interest in interacting with these systems because there's money associated with it. Call them interest groups eventually. Yeah, I think that's good. Moving on to the next idea. There's a lot of eyes and hands involved in a system that locks you down for 10 plus years. Now, this is where I go back to talking about from the beginning, from preschool to elementary to middle school to high school. This is why I say it's an integral part of your life, because at the end of the day, you are locked down for 10 years of your life. Think of the people that are cycled in and out of the education system. They are there for 10 years. You are there for 10 plus years of interacting with the system. And to add a level of dynamic to this, don't forget, some states will jail you for truancy laws. And truancy laws essentially say that, well, it's not to say that if you don't put your kid in a school that they'll go after you, right? There is the concept of homeschooling. But that's the thing. If you do not register your son or daughter in this system, to some degree, the way that some truancy laws are written in some states, they will go after you. They will force you to put your kid in a school. And if your kid misses school, right? Kids missing school, blah, blah, blah. People around will roll their eyes, blah, blah, blah. Caring for children, teach, deal time. Okay, no, that's a whole other idea. Either way, truancy laws essentially will put you in jail. They'll either give you a ticket, they'll fine you, or in most extreme cases, the police will knock on your door and jail you for not properly caring for your children. And it's not that and this is where I kind of went into this where I deviated the idea, is that people will roll their eyes at this idea of, well, what do we do? Do we destroy schools? Do we destroy the educational system? And the reason why I wrote this is because the idea, or at least the burden of caring for your children, teaching them yourselves, dealing with them, the time, patience, etc., etc. There are all these things that will come into people's heads, and they'll be like, I don't got time for that, right? I barely got time for my own job. I barely got time to do this, X, Y, Z. There's levels to this that feel daunting. Like it'll put a huge amount of burden on the people. Now, right? I wrote, imagine the burden of that. And it goes back to a habit. It's become a habit to depend on these systems. It's become a habit to allow the education system to just carry on with the way it's been. This is how my mom and dad did it. And this is how, well, it doesn't go that far back because by then you're already getting into the 50s or the 70s. It depends on how old your parents are. But not the point. But it does come down to the fact that there's a huge amount of burden to even consider the idea that school is problematic. And that's just the educational building. That's a whole different, either way, I'll get to that later. So back to the fact that this system locks you down for 10 plus years. So out of those, right, give or take, it's 12 to 14 years, depending on how you did your kid. Either way, the point that I'm getting to in a larger system is the fact that this is forced, enforced, and it is foundational. Because at the end of the day, the concept of school, at least what it's supposed to do, is supposed to give you a foundational sense of something. What that is goes back to, what's the objective? What's the objective of school? What did it, by and large, what did it really do? Did it really teach you anything that you used outside of school? That's why, you I don't know, at least I heard it when I was growing up. You hear a lot of other kids kind of say, why does this matter if I'm not going to use this outside of here? And they're not wrong, right? There's this secret sense that comes into you where you're just like, well, fuck, this kid's not wrong. But at the same time, you know that it's going against the status quo. But it comes down from the fact that this is a habit. And if we break this habit, we have to embrace a lifestyle that we don't know what it looks like, right? Taking matters into your own hands. But not to harbor on that idea yet, because that's a whole other part of the book that I'm nowhere near dealing with yet. Because there is an answer. It's not all fucking vague, imaginary, illusionary shit. There is something to be done. But now, again, this goes back into embrace a new lifestyle, or what am I supposed to do, right? That's the main thing that really comes to mind when you have to really look at the overall, right? You have to zoom out from pre-K, zoom out from elementary school, zoom out from middle school. And that's where, right, when people do that in the normal sense, they'll think private education or private institutions are where it's at. right? They'll go to private schools, they'll go to charter schools, they'll go to schools that offer a different curriculum or a different program. But government kind of already has a foot in the door. They already have a systemized, standardized way of doing things. So they kind of force that onto these other schools using money. At the end of the day, it's like, hey, you get a certain amount of funding based on how many students you have at XYZ. Either way, it's just more cognitive dissonance. It's a weird way of thinking you got freedom, but you really don't got the freedom. And either way, at the end of the day, school is conditioning. But here I wrote conditioning for easy solutions. People are conditioned to look for the easiest solution. And that's where I brought up the example of going private or going to X, Y, or Z type of school, and they're going to offer a better education. Either way, let's not address the idea that just came to my head. But the big idea here for later in writing this is hijacked human conditioning programming. Now, either way, when I want to get down to what I mean by a conditioning program, if it was either by coincidence or by design, there is a loop that exists. There is this self-feeding like mechanism that exists within this system. And how do I say? Okay. People's worship of this resembles zealot cult worship. And that just means, like those people that are just blinded by their own faith, by their own holy text or whatever, the way that they live their life. It could get violent to some cases, but at the end of the day, it goes back to, this is the lifestyle we've lived. This is how things have always been. Why should I change this? And it's also culturally backed. That's a whole other meaning. Groups within subgroups have an antibody programming to maintain a status quo. Now, what I'm essentially saying here is, when at least my generation was growing up, everyone had the same idea. You're going to college. You should go to college. You should do this. You should live your life like this. And everybody says it, right? This is what you call a death by 1,000 cuts. It is the response that you hear left, right, center, over and over and over again, that it becomes a conditioning factor in your life. That's why I said an antibody programming to maintain a status quo. Where the status quo being, go to college. You need higher education. Where did that come from? At some point in time, that idea had merit to it. It had some validity to its existence. But because people just kept repeating it over and over and over again, that it becomes a hijacking mechanism, and it conditions you into believing this programming. Now, I'm not saying that university, higher learning, or the educational system is a problem in the sense of we shouldn't have it. It's just, it's lost its course. It's lost its usability. It's lost its useful factor. That doesn't exist anymore. Because who knows if the education system was ever designed in a meaningful way that it actually produces results. It's just the education system that we have now has stopped producing results, is what I'm saying. Should really kind of preface that at the beginning of all this. Either way. So, groups within subgroups, right? Depending if you're from X, Y, or Z culture, Asian, Latino, white, black. Within all these groups, you have subgroups. And those subgroups will largely define themselves as Caucasian, English, Irish, Italian, Latino, being Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadorian, Puerto Rican, da-da-da-da-da. Or if you're, right? That's what subgroups mean. Even within the smaller groups, within the larger groups, you will have this kind of antibody programming where other people kind of keep people in check, right? It's just, you're going to marry this type of person. You're going to live this kind of life. You're going to go to this type of school. You can't do X, Y, or Z because whatever. Yes. Either way. Yes, subcultures maintain some sense of equilibrium. That just means that even though there's an overall programming, even within internal subgroups, there is a different kind of programming. And that's usually maintained culturally. It's kind of why some Asians only date other Asians. It's because it's kind of something it comes from grandma, or it comes from the moms, or it comes from like the female dynamic of those subculture groups, but they have their own equilibrium. But in the Great American Experiment, certain directives, movements, or ideological shifts can be introduced and steered. Now, this is very new. This is more something that occurred from the 1970s and on, mainly because that's when iconisms were kind of introduced, where certain entrepreneur lives their life like this, certain fitness individual does his life like this, right? That's where you get iconisms, where you have a new way of living life, a new way of doing things. And now with how marketing works and with how certain things can be popularized, these movements can't be introduced into new subcultures, new groups, new, I want to call them city sectors, but the way the United States works is LA has their own way of doing things. Northern California has their own way of doing things. New York to New Jersey to Baltimore, right? Like, you have these subculture groups that won't necessarily mingle with one another. That's why you can have famous people from each corner of America, but they're not famous across the way in America. Does that make sense? You can have people that are famous in New York, but they're not necessarily famous in Los Angeles. A lot of that has to do with the fact that some things only really hit in certain regional areas, and it won't cross that threshold of, how do I say this? Right? Not everybody can be world level famous, right? Like Michael Jackson, you could say Michael Jackson's name in anywhere around the world and they'll know who that is. But there are some celebrities that you'll say their name in a different country and it won't click to the other individual. And that's because that's a different level of fame. There's a different level of, how do I say this? Iconism, right? There's like a different level of, does that stick with the other culture's mind? And it doesn't necessarily jump that gap. Let's leave that one for later. I should mention educational facilities have a whole other set of problems. Okay. Now, this was just me talking about the problems of the educational objective. At least that's what I was trying to pinpoint down when I was trying to write all this down. Is I'm trying to point out what the objective here is. And well, at least I haven't really broken down into what was the objective of us learning biological science? What was the objective of learning anatomy, right? They give us a syllabus for that, right? When you look at the syllabus is this is what you're going to learn in this class today. But when you break that all down, not all teachers are the same. Not all teaching methods are the same. And not each generation has a different gap in their education. I remember when I was working as a tutor, my early 20s, I remember I was pretty good at math. And when I'm teaching these kids the math that I learned, and they taught me the method of how they were solving their problems, they looked at me and they were like, yo, mister, your way of doing things is much easier. because they had to like, when you're solving, when you're solving for X or Y, they had to like draw a box. They had to draw a box, and they had to like put the X and the Y, and like, I don't even know. I didn't even want to learn that method. I just looked at them and I was just like, stop. I'm going to teach you the way that I was taught, right? And I remember that when they were doing certain algebra, they were just doing it in a whole other way. And when I taught them my method, they were just like, yo, this is much easier to learn. And I started realizing, and between that year, it was like at least a full graduating class, right? Because I was already 4 years older than they were. So there was already gaps between the way things were done with one group of kids and the next 4 years. There's already a whole other way of how they're teaching. In this case, it was algebra. So what did that pipeline look like? And by pipeline, I'm just saying that means to some degree there was policy that was introduced on a government level that moved towards, well, at least, right, it goes up for a vote. And when it goes up for a vote, it eventually becomes actual policy that then has to be fed to teachers' unions. And then, right, does it immediately go to teachers' unions? No, because I'd imagine that from voting, it would go to the book publishers, right? Because the book publishers have to prepare the textbook in advance. That means whole waves of authors, editors, the people who kind of like do the font setting when they're designing the pages, when they're putting pictures, when they're making examples. Right? There's a procedure that goes into making the textbook, and then once the textbook's made, I'd imagine it goes to the teacher union. And from the teachers union, it has to then go into practice. And by practice, I literally mean practice, right? Like the teachers have to recognize that, oh, we're doing this a whole other way? All right, cool. And then from practice, it eventually has to go to the students' hands. Either way, I don't know why I wrote all that. But, and that's just me describing the objective. The objective, I literally mean like, soldier, this is your objective for this mission, right? When you send your kid off to primary school, elementary school, there is an objective in mind for what that child is about to experience when he goes into that grade, when he goes into that experience. Now, I should mention again that the educational facility, that whole part of the equation, has a whole other set of problems. I'm only talking about textbooks. I'm only talking about the policy level shit, like and that's not even talking about the teacher. I literally just want to stick this idea with the book publisher, government, policy, standardization, and how that kind of interacts with industry, and how industry feeds into politics, and how politics will then drive the teachers union, or at least the teaching methodology, or at least the objective of how this will roll out. Now, I didn't get to this as written, but educational facilities have their own other set of problems, because a great example of this that I always like using, because I don't remember who I learned this from, but it's like when we were younger, we would put other kids into positions of leadership, right? We would look at the cooler kid in the class and we'd look to him towards answers, right? Now, these kids are all the same age. These kids have all the same life experience in terms of like how long they've been on Earth. But yet, within the internal group dynamic, you'll always have that one kid will stick out while all the other kids will follow his lead. The reason why that's problematic is because who is that kid? Who are his parents? And what are that kid's value system? And how does that kid influence or affect the other kids around him? Now, right, like there's this whole dynamic, it's a social dynamic that occurs amongst groups of children. That creates a whole other set of problems for the individual, because those experiences will then affect and kind of mold that child into something that his parents have no control over. It's kind of why you have some cases where, right, like there's a bad apple in the bunch sort of ideology where all it takes is one influence in a child's life, and that child will completely change forever. The way he looks at life, the way he interacts with it. Like, you could have a really bright kid, but if he has, right, he could have great teachers, he could have a great school, but if he has one student in his classroom that will negatively influence that kid, there's a few ways that it could all turn out. That kid will go from a bright student, or at least a bright social student, to being reclusive, to becoming more shy, towards becoming more violent, towards being more rebellious, right? And that all fits under social dynamics. That's why educational facilities have a whole other set of problems. And parents have no control over that. Parents have little to no control over who their kids are interacting with and how that kid is shaped. And that's kind of that's a whole other basket of ideas that I haven't really touched, because that gets into more developmental psychology, and I don't understand social dynamics like that in terms of children. Usually the psychology that we learn later in our lives is dealing with the repercussions, or at least dealing with the people that already have a subset. How do I say this? Right? We're dealing with the result. We're not dealing with what was the math problem before the result, right? What were the things that had occurred in this individual's life? What were the experiences that he accumulated that led to this result? We're always viewing psychology from that perspective instead of viewing it as a whole. And that's why I really appreciate Gestalt psychology, because it looks at the whole instead of looking at the result. And that's why I tend to believe educational facilities are a whole other basket of problems. And this is kind of why there's a lot of backlash when it comes down to homeschooling your kids, because there's this negative connotation that if you homeschool your kid, he becomes an immediate outcast in terms of a social dynamic. And that's why homeschooled kids will usually get tossed into school around high school. So it's to kind of give them that, I don't know. But it is, I don't know. I'll leave that here for sure.